Here. And it is recording. Hey, today we are doing a presentation on life in the United States and Florida, just general legal issues. These issues we're going to cover are really focused in on the international student experience at the University of Florida. This is part of a International Student Success Series being put on all week by UFGIFT, called it's the UFGATOR International Focus Team. It's just a group of people from around campus from all kinds of different disciplines that come together and try to serve our international students better. Our fearless leader is Dr. Shu-Yi Wang from the Counseling and Wellness Center, who kind of keeps us focused and keeps us all together. So I thank him for his help. And let's go ahead to the introductory page, Young. So this is who we are. I'm John Adcock. I'm the Director of Student Legal Services and decades of civil practice, also known as El Jefe. That was Young's addition. But yeah, I've been an attorney since 1986, and I've been at the University of Florida at Student Legal Services for 20 years and have been the director for about 10 years. And I have a wide variety of experience practicing law. And then Young also is an experienced attorney. He's been with Student Legal Services for about a year and a half. But he was a criminal prosecutor before that for a number of years, and then has some civil experience also as in-house counsel here in Gainesville. So. The next page, please. I'll tell you a little bit about Student Legal Services in general. We are basically a law office that is with 4 full-time attorneys. We are located in the union here at UF, and our job is to represent UF students at no additional cost to them. I say additional because our office is actually funded by your activity and service fees. So we do not represent the University of Florida. There's a whole nother office that does that, General Counsel's office. We represent UF students individually, those that come to us with issues. And it's the normal attorney-client relationship when a student comes to us. It's confidential. We don't tell your advisor, we don't tell your parents, we don't tell anybody else what's going on. So it's a free and confidential service. All you need is to be taking 6 credit hours and be someone who has paid the activity and service fee. We also represent some student organizations. Did I have somebody having an issue with the sound? Okay. We have a little blurb there about the types of cases we handle. We do a variety of cases. Landlord-tenant cases are our primary type of case. We do full in-court representation on that. And that's for off-campus housing. We don't assist with on-campus housing. That would give us a conflict of interest with this with the university. So, but as far as off-campus housing, we do everything from lease reviews before you sign a lease, all the way to helping fight a landlord after you leave if they're trying to collect money from you, and everything in between. We do some minor criminal work. We do expunging and sealing of those charges. We do simple divorces, name changes, and a whole bunch of other kind of general areas of the law. Consumer matters and things like that. We also do free notaries. That's done on a walk-in basis generally. You can actually get a notary done remotely now. We, during the pandemic, figured out how to do that remotely. So if you can't come here, but you need something notarized, you just need to call and make an appointment with Joy, and she'll be able to do that for you. And let me just say, we're going to kind of jump around to a lot of different areas of the law. some of this stuff's going to be really kind of basic overview kind of stuff about the law. Then some of it will be more specific. I mean, what we've tried to do is kind of tailor it to the kinds of issues that have been asked and the kind of issues that we've seen come up over the years, especially in regards to international students. Although all of our domestic students could stand to learn a whole lot more about the law too, to tell you the truth. And let me just, well, since we're going to kind of jump around a good bit, if you have any questions as we go along, I mean, go ahead and drop it in the chat. And if it's something that we can answer, then we'll do. Yong's going to be doing most of the presenting after this, so I'll be monitoring the chat. If it's something I can answer real quickly, I'll try to, or we'll address it orally for everybody. Let me just kind of remind everybody again, this is being recorded. This is not a confidential setting, so if you have any particular issues, you know, unless you want it to be public, just make an appointment with us and come see us. But if you have general questions, it would be appropriate to ask them here. So without further ado, if John would like to jump in and start teaching you about the law.
All right. Thanks, John. As John mentioned, my name is Young Oh. I'm a staff attorney here at Student Legal Services. I just wanted to start off with essentially just really basic information. I don't know if this is even legal information, but just an overview of how things essentially work in the US. So the first thing I should mention is that for emergencies in the US, you have to dial 911. And that's for all types of emergency services like fire, medical, and police services. I know for some countries, it's like 999. Or 119, and there's like different numbers for each, like fire, medical, or police, but in the US it's just 911. And you tell them what the problem is, and then they'll direct the appropriate agency to respond. So keep that in mind. And just a general overview of the different types of governments that govern us. This is in order of size. Obviously, the federal government is the largest. And then there's also the state government. For example, like the state of Florida has its own government. The county, our county is Alachua County, and then the city governments. So Gainesville has their own government. And each type of government has their own area of jurisdiction, and each can pass civil and criminal laws. Sometimes they overlap. Like for criminal stuff, sometimes the federal government and the state government can try to come after you for criminal violations for the same crime. But that's just a general overview of the different agencies and the government agencies that are essentially watching over you. There are two types of, I guess, criminal justice system in the US. The number one is the criminal system, obviously, and the punishments for those violating those laws would be imprisonment, fine. But for civil violations are usually punished with money fines. You can't go to jail for example, like if you owed someone money and you didn't pay it back, you would essentially just, get sued to, pay back the money. You do in the US have a right to a jury trial, and that's for all criminal cases. And a lot of civil cases, I forgot what the threshold is, but most civil cases, you do have a right to a jury trial, but that can be waived in a contract. For example, if you sign a lease with a landlord, typically they do have a jury trial waiver, but in criminal cases, it's harder to waive your right to a jury trial. Both parties would have to waive it, like the prosecution and you would have to waive that. And typically these are people just plucked from normal life. As long as they have a driver's license, I think they qualify to be a juror, and are US citizens qualified to serve as a juror. And they're usually 6 to 12 people. You do have the right to remain silent in the US. I don't know how it works in other countries, but in the US, you don't have to talk at all in terms of criminal cases. Like, for example, if you are asked questions from a law enforcement officer, you should answer, but you typically don't have an obligation to talk to a law enforcement officer. But in civil cases, you do. They can force you to talk. And then this is just a general overview of the age requirements in the US. So the first one is the right to drive, or the privilege to drive. You should be 16 years or older. You can get like a learner's permit when you're 15, in which you can drive with like an accompanying person who has a driver's license. But 16 is usually the age anyone can drive in the US. And then 18 years of age or older, that's the main age threshold. Usually once you turn 18, you're considered an adult. You can vote in elections, and that's the age of consent, at least in Florida and in most states in the US. Age of consent to sexual encounters. So keep that in mind. And also, because you're considered an adult after you turn 18, that is the age at which you can start to sign contracts and be legally bound to the terms of the contract. All right. And then 21 years of age or older is the age that's required to drink alcohol in the US. I know it seems kind of crazy. You can like vote in elections when you're 18 and drive when you're 16. But in the US, you have to be 21 years of age or older to drink alcohol. And also in Florida, at least, you have to be 21 or older to possess or smoke tobacco products. And the last one is really not a law, but typically rental companies will require that you're at least 21 years of age or older to rent a car. This is just a brief overview of the criminal justice system in Florida. I just wanted to highlight this because, again, I don't know how things work in other countries, but in the US, I just want to highlight that the criminal justice system, you get entered into it with an arrest or a notice to appear or a criminal citation. If neither of those things happen to you, chances are you're not being charged with a crime. So either you have to be arrested or be given some sort of citation where it specifically tells you that you're being charged with a crime. And then, as you can see, you go through several hearings, and then again, you have a right to a jury trial. And then whatever the jury decides, if they find you guilty, you would move on to sentencing, and the judge would decide what punishments you would get. All right, we're going to get into some uncomfortable topics, just a warning. So the number one topic that we're going to cover is domestic violence. Essentially, domestic violence comes in two forms. The first one is a quote unquote battery. That's what it's called in Florida, at least. And battery is basically an unwanted touching or striking of another person. Notice, like, even if you touch someone without their consent, that's technically a battery. And also an assault, which is basically threatening to do violence and essentially causing fear in the other person. And what makes this domestic is that these actions, the battery or the assault, happens between relatives, spouses, former spouses, or any of those people who are included in there. So essentially, it's between two people who live together currently, who share a child, or have lived together as a family. That's the typical rule. So the punishments in terms of the battery or the assault doesn't get increased, but as we'll discuss like in the next slide, I guess the way law enforcement decides to handle these cases will differ if it's considered a domestic battery or an assault. So in Florida, and also generally in the US, domestic violence is taken very seriously. And the reason is because usually domestic violence escalates, they tend to escalate. So if it starts with, let's say, a slap or, something quote unquote not as big a deal, it tends to escalate into something more serious, like, some sort of physical, like harder violence, or even to murder. So in the US, law enforcement takes these cases very seriously because there is a tendency for escalation. And just to give you a picture of how seriously law enforcement takes these kind of cases, if this happens in front of a child, the Department of Children and Families in Florida, or whatever the equivalent is in other states, they may get involved and take your child away from your home if the child is a witness or somehow involved in the domestic violence. And also in criminal cases, and this is true for all criminal cases in the US, even if the victim tells the prosecutor that they don't want to proceed, they don't want to testify, they don't want to do this, like they don't want this to go forward, the prosecutor can still move forward. They have absolute discretion on whether a criminal case proceeds or not. And also being drunk or under the influence of alcohol or drugs is not an excuse, like at all, in the US, especially for domestic violence. You can say like, oh, I was drunk, I'll never do that again. Well, that doesn't really make it any worse, at least in the eyes of law enforcement. So don't think that just because you were drunk or under the influence that you can kind of ask for leniency.
And can I just add, just kind of for emphasis here, that first part, or the second sentence there, basically, if the police get called for a domestic violence call, even if there's not any, really terrible violence going on, but just a real, like a screaming fight and things are getting pushed around or something, and, the table gets knocked over. If the police get called, they're going to probably arrest somebody. So somebody's going to go to jail, get their mugshot taken. They're going to have a record they're going to have to deal with. So it can go from just a basic argument with your partner to being a serious criminal matter that might get you removed from the country too at some point as an international student. So it can escalate like that into something that's out of control, and that's what we really want to emphasize here. Is you just got to be very, very careful about this.
All right, the next topic. So just as domestic violence is taken seriously in the US, driving under the influence is also taken seriously. And the reason is because obviously they can lead to homicides or, people getting killed or serious accidents. So in Florida, I know it says driving under the influence, but technically, it's called actual physical control. If you have the ability to drive a vehicle, and a vehicle can be a car, a motorcycle, a moped, or a bicycle, or a golf cart, or anything that's like not human powered, or I guess it's not on rails, and you have to physically control the vehicle. If you can control it and you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, that's technically a DUI. So for example, if you go out drinking at a bar and you realize you're too drunk and you go back to your car and decide to sleep in the car until you get sober or not as drunk, technically, if a cop or if a law enforcement officer comes to your door and then you roll down your window and the officer smells alcohol, they can start a DUI investigation and you can be arrested for driving under the influence. Even though you're not driving, even though you're in your car, even though you're theoretically doing the responsible thing by trying to sleep one off, you can still be arrested for DUI and taken to jail. And you can actually be convicted of that. So the best advice is to take an Uber or hire an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi. And also, I believe UF offers the SNAP, like a transport service. You can call SNAP and see if they'll give you a ride. I think SNAP specifically is for these types of cases where you're kind of not in the best condition to drive. So I would utilize that because if you get caught and are arrested for DUI, even if you're not convicted, you have to go to jail. I mean, that's for DUIs, you have to go to jail for at least like 8 hours or until you're quote unquote sober. And it's going to cost you a lot of money because you're going to have to hire an attorney. And if you get convicted, it's going to cost you even more money because there are so many sanctions that go with DUIs because they're taken so seriously. There's so many sanctions that cost money for you to do. Not only that, I mean, it's going to stay on your criminal record for the rest of your life, or however long you end up staying in the US, which will affect your employment opportunities and anything else that requires a background check.
You can affect your immigration status also.
Yeah. All right, so the next topic is cannabis, or commonly known as marijuana. And that's what it really looks like. Like the top picture is I guess like when it's quote unquote prepared to be smoked. And then the bottom picture is the actual plant, the cannabis plant. And technically what's illegal is what's called I don't even know how to pronounce that, tetrahydrocannabinol, the THC, and that, which is the chemical inside the cannabis. That's what's illegal. And under federal law, as I mentioned, like there's different types of governments at play here. So under federal law, the nationwide law, it's still illegal. Any form of cannabis, whether it's medicinal or whatever the form, gummies, whatnot, it's still illegal for you to possess. So even if, like for example, in Florida, you can use it for medicinal purposes if you get a doctor to prescribe it for you. Even if under Florida law, it's legal and you're using it in a legal way, under the federal law, it's still illegal. So they can still prosecute you and put you in jail for having cannabis. Some states have like decriminalized it, make it like a civil citation, not a criminal one. If you're ever caught with cannabis, some states have like flat out just made it legal up to a certain amount where you can just use it for whatever purposes. But in Florida, you have to know that recreational use is illegal. But if you get a doctor to prescribe it for you and you're able to get, it's called a medical marijuana card. If you're able to get that card, you can go into, I'm sure you've seen dispensaries around here. You can go into a dispensary and then show them your card and then order some cannabis and imbibe it if you wanted to. If you don't go at it the proper way in Florida, it's up to a year in jail. It's a first-degree misdemeanor. So it's up to a year in jail and a $1,000 fine. And also, it may have consequences beyond the criminal sanctions. For example, grants. Maybe the experiment or the whatever project you're pursuing involves like a controlled substance. And if you have like a criminal charge that relates to substances, like they may not grant you or they may exclude you from grants. You may get in trouble with the school and also like employment or housing or whatever. It may have consequences, and also immigration. It may have consequences beyond just jail and a fine.
Yeah. If you go to a state where it's legal, like we went to California this summer, and some of our colleagues decided to go try some of that legal weed. So, but then just put it this way, it's a bad idea to get on the airplane with it if you're going to, if you're going to go to other places where it's legal, fine, as long as you're complying with the laws of that state there. But don't get on a plane and come back to Florida or any other state where it's not legal, still carrying the substance.
All right, the next topic that we wanted to cover is stalking. Again, this may be a difference in cultures, but we just wanted to explain it just to be clear what's expected of you in the state of Florida, and so you can stay out of trouble. So in Florida, stalking is defined as repeatedly following, harassing, or cyber stalking someone without their permission or without their consent. It's a first-degree misdemeanor. You can end up spending up to 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine. Now, if you make a threat while you're repeatedly following, harassing, or cyber stalking, that becomes a felony, which means you can spend up to it's a third-degree felony, and you can spend up to 5 years in prison and face a $5,000 fine. Essentially, the practical tip is to essentially just not contact anyone who flat out tells you that they no longer want you to contact them or follow them or, contact them online. If someone tells you that, I mean, obviously you should stop doing that. But also if they ignore you, if they're trying to be nice, give you subtle hints that they don't want to speak with you anymore or want to just interact with you anymore, just don't interact with them, because that could constitute stalking. If they're ignoring your texts, ignoring your messages online, just take that as a sign to not contact them anymore, that they don't want to contact you. It's better to, err in the side of caution instead of, continuing to contact them and face some sort of complaint, or at worst, some sort of law enforcement officer stopping by your door, and because this person made a complaint against you. The next one, this one is I see this all the time, even not just international students, but just every student. You'd be surprised how few people are aware of this. In Florida, we're what's called a two-party consent state. So essentially, if you're on the phone or if you're talking to someone and that the circumstances lead you to believe that this person wants this conversation to be private, or objectively, it seems like this is a private conversation, you can't record it without that other person's consent. So both parties to a conversation, or all parties to a conversation, need to consent for it to be recorded. The typical situation is, like, let's say you're talking with somebody over the phone and you decide to hit that record button without their consent. Well, technically that's a felony. You can face up to 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine if somehow, like, you use that recording or someone found out that you're recording. Or if you're speaking with, let's say, an advisor, and that advisor doesn't know that you're recording the conversation, and you have your phone in your pocket or some sort of recording device and you're recording without that person knowing that you're recording, that's a felony. That's a crime, and a serious felon, or a serious crime at that. So make sure you get everyone's consent or make it obvious that you're recording. The best practice is to ask for their consent. Or if the circumstances indicate that this is like a public, if you're in a coffee shop, obviously it's not a private setting. But just to be safe, I would ask that person or tell that person that you're recording, so that they're aware. All right, just as law enforcement officers in the US take, domestic violence, DUIs, and drug crime seriously, they tend to be proactive in certain aspects of crime. And the way they're proactive is by going, quote unquote, undercover, which basically means they pretend to be like an average citizen and try to get people committing crimes, or get them to commit crimes, or just kind of entice them into committing crimes. And those are called stings. We call them stings, like drug stings, sex stings, or I don't know what other kinds there are, but so the main kind of sting that we wanted to cover are these sex stings, okay? So as I mentioned, the age of consent in the US and in Florida is 18 years old. If someone is under 18 years old, they cannot legally consent to sex with another adult. So if you're 19 or 20 and the person you're speaking with is 17, no matter if it's a boy or a girl, if they're under 18, they cannot consent to sex with you. And the most common sting that I've seen in my time is an officer goes online and pretends to be like a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old boy or a girl and starts speaking with you, and they try to get you to meet with them, at which point you show up at the place and there's like 10 officers waiting for you, waiting to arrest you. Or they pretend to be a prostitute, whether underage or overage. They could be like 20 years old, and they pretend to be a prostitute and get you to quote a price. And this can happen online, and then you show up at the place and then they arrest you. And also, the prostitution stings can happen in real life. So let's say you're driving or you're at a bar and a woman or a man sits next to you and it starts, offering you offering their services to you. And then as soon as they quote a price and then you agree to give that amount to that person for the services, you've basically committed prostitution, or you've essentially, you've committed prostitution. So you're guilty of a crime, at which point you would be arrested and taken to jail. Another type of sting they have is drug stings, in which they pretend to be either a drug buyer or a drug seller. And once you buy the drugs from them or hand over the money, or you take possession of the drugs, you would be handcuffed and taken to jail.
I told Young about the University of Florida Police Department did a sting just soon after I started working here, so it's several years ago. But they basically were going online and getting people to agree to sell their ADD medicines, Adderall. I can't remember the other one, but they're basically study drugs, not really even street drugs, but that's still a controlled substance. So they set these people up, and when the student would show up, there's like supposed to meet them at a bench on campus somewhere. The cops arrested them, took them to jail. They were charged with felonies. So just kind of a cautionary tale there that we're not just talking about cocaine and marijuana and things like that. Other drugs like that, and in particular the ADD type drugs that people don't really consider to be drugs of abuse so much. Those are controlled substances. You can't sell those. You can't buy those unless it's done with a prescription.
And also, I did want to mention a very common misconception. I don't know where this started, but so there's this misunderstanding, even like among American citizens and people who know nothing else other than the US. They think that if you ask an undercover officer, like, hey, are you an officer or are you a law enforcement officer? They don't have to tell you. They can lie to your face and tell you, no, I'm not a law enforcement officer. And then, once you do the criminal act, they can still arrest you. Just because they lie to you and say they're not a law enforcement officer doesn't make the arrest invalid or unlawful. Just keep that in mind. And this is just, I guess it's a practical tip. So I'm sure most of you drive, but if you're driving in a vehicle and you see behind you a police vehicle with its lights on or its sirens on, you will have to pull over. And what that means is you have to essentially stop your vehicle on the side of the road or wherever you are. As soon as you find a place that's safe, where there's no traffic whizzing by or anything, just pull into that area and then stop. And once you stop, what typically happens is that once you stop, the officer will come to your car, knock on your window, you roll down the window, and they'll ask you for, well, first of all, they'll ask you, like, do you know why I pulled you over? You shouldn't tell them, you shouldn't answer that question. And then they'll ask you for your driver's license and your registration and your insurance information. In these scenarios, when you get pulled over by law enforcement officers, no matter who they are, do what they tell you, okay? And now I'm assuming that you'll be pulled over by like a marked patrol vehicle. So if you see like the overhead lights and you see like the paint on the car says, Alachua County Sheriff's Office or Gainesville Police Department, just do what they say. Everything, you can argue about it later on, like the officer can give you a ticket or arrest you or whatever. At that point, at the side of the road is not the place to argue, and it's not the place to fight your case. You would have to, I know it's going to be hard to do, but even if you're unjustly arrested or unjustly given a ticket, you will have to argue that in front of a judge. So keep that in mind. And also, you can't take care of, let's say you're speeding and you get pulled over. You can't get rid of the speeding infraction or take care of the issue at the side of the road. You can't give the officer money to, if the officer gives you a ticket and it says fine of $160, you don't give the officer $160 or offer them any kind of money because that could be considered a bribe or an attempted bribe, and if the officer is having a bad day, they could arrest you for that. So just keep in mind, like the side of the road is not where you take care of business or your issues. It's later on in a courtroom or in a Zoom meeting or whatever, Zoom hearing. So just do what the officer tells you to do. And also an important note is that you don't, because there are so many guns in the US and almost everyone in Florida has a gun, don't make any sudden movements and don't reach for anything unless the officer, asks you for something and tells you that you can reach for something. You should typically ask the officer, hey, like I'm about to reach for something. Is that okay? Or just let them know and move slowly, because some officers will be real jumpy and will be quick with that gun or a taser and thinking that you're reaching for something that you shouldn't be reaching for. Okay, now the next topic is the most common issues that we deal with here at Student Legal Services, and that's landlord-tenant issues. The number one thing that everybody should know, and this is not just for international students, but all students of UF, they need to know that signing a lease agreement is a big, big deal. These lease agreements are binding. So anything that it contains, you're basically agreeing to it or you're obligating yourself to do it. So you really need to read through them. Every single paragraph, every single word, you need to read through them. Or, we offer lease agreement reviews. So if you set an appointment with us, we'll read it and then go over it with you paragraph by paragraph and explain to you what everything says. But you should go through it either yourself or with somebody before you sign it, because it does have serious implications.
There is no waiting period. It's as soon as you sign it, you're bound to it. So there's a misconception amongst a lot of domestic students that there's like a 3-day waiting period where they could cancel, or 3-day cancellation period. There's not a 3-minute cancellation period. There's none.
All right. I think that 3-day cancellation period is for only like mortgages, I think.
Yeah.
So another thing to keep in mind is that landlords, or the people who own the property, or the property manager renting you the property, they can require, there's nothing illegal about them requiring a large security deposit, which is like the money they ask that you give them to hold in case you damage something, and then they could, use that money to fix or repair whatever needs to be repaired. They can require you to give a large amount if you don't have any credit history, like you don't have a history of borrowing and repaying money in the US, or someone, typically someone, they'll require someone who's in the US or is a US, at least a permanent resident. If you don't have someone guaranteeing that you will repay or you will pay rent and keep up to date with your financial obligations with the lease agreement. If you don't have either of those things, they can
బట్టలే
require you.
ఫోటోల కింద కూర్చొని దిగినాం. ఎంత ఉంది అనుకున్నది?
I didn't understand that. Can you, you have a question?
లేదు, నేను ఇన్స్టానే మొన్న సెట్ చేసిన, చూస్తలేదు అసలు. ఏదో అప్పుడప్పుడు ఇట్లా
Let's see. Go ahead, John.
Oh, there we go. All right. We're going to assume that's not a question, but if it is, just
If
type
it
it
is,
in the
put
chat.
it in, put it in the chat, please.
Yeah. So in Florida, a new thing that's developed is instead of paying a security deposit, again, which is like a sum of money that landlords will want to hold and charge you against if there are any damages once you move out, they can have the option to charge you a monthly fee, like a non-refundable monthly fee in place of a security deposit. Essentially what it is you're paying for their insurance policy for damages that you may cause to the property. And it doesn't prevent them from going after you for damages anyway. So, but we just wanted to make you aware that instead, there's nothing illegal about this. In fact, it's legal, like the law specifically allows this. They can make you pay a monthly fee instead of giving a security deposit, and then still go after you for damages at the end if they chose to. Another important thing to consider is whether the lease that you're signing is individual, like only your name is on the lease, or it's a joint lease. Joint lease meaning like there are like 2 or 3 names along with yours on the lease agreement, and everybody signs. The main difference is, and it's pretty important, an individual lease, obviously you're the one who's obligated, but a joint lease, basically you can be held responsible for the actions of your roommates. It's what's called a joint and several obligation, which basically means the landlord can come after only you or all of you for the financial obligations or the damages that you cause. So keep that in mind. If you're thinking about signing a lease with 2, 3 names, whatever those other people do, you may be held responsible for that. So I don't know if you're trying to avoid that, but if you are, go with an individual lease or 3 or however many separate individual leases for the same unit instead of a joint lease. And also just a practical tip, document everything about the condition of the unit before you move in. I know like a lot of you probably signed leases before you even came to the US. Unfortunately, your lease agreement does have that provision where it says you agree to the condition of the unit. But for future reference, if you have a lease agreement that you're contemplating signing, go and see the unit before you sign the lease agreement. And then after you sign it and you're moved in, take pictures of every single inch of the apartment that you're responsible for. And also, I would suggest doing a video walkthrough of the entire apartment, just to document the condition of the place as soon as you moved in, so that later on, when you move out, when the landlord tries to, and they inevitably do try to come after you, they'll try to charge you for carpet and cabinets and whatnot. If you can show, hey, this was like this before we even moved in, or when we moved in, like we had nothing to do with this, you would have a better argument at disputing those charges after you move out.
We have one other little thing in landlord-tenant land. You do have some rights in regards to the condition of the premises. The landlord has an obligation to keep the premises up to at least a minimal standard, depending on different factors. So if something's broke or if something's leaking, or if you have any kind of problem like that, a maintenance issue, and the landlord won't fix it, that's when you come see us, and we will, if we can, if it's something we legally can help you do, we'll make them fix it.
Car accidents. Again, this is another thing, I mean, a lot of UF students in general don't know. So when you get into a car accident, my opinion is you should call law enforcement regardless. Just call law enforcement if you get into a car accident. But legally, law enforcement doesn't have to respond unless there's an injury, fatality, it's a hit and run situation. For example, like you get into a car accident and then the person just takes off. A DUI, one of the cars is immobilized, like you can't drive it anymore. If there's a commercial vehicle involved, or the damage seems to be more than $500, which is a very low threshold. But legally, they don't have to respond unless those requirements or one of those requirements are met. But I would call law enforcement as soon as you get into a car accident. You can dial 911. Again, that's the emergency number. But if you don't call law enforcement or make the choice to not call law enforcement, and it doesn't meet one of those requirements that are on the slide right now, you yourself have to personally file a police or a crash report. It says police report, but it's actually a crash report. You have to file that within 10 days after the accident happens. And if you don't file an accident report or a crash report, then you can actually get a ticket for that. So if you get into like a very minor accident, for example, like you hit a bicycle and it causes some damage, like $50 or $100 worth of damage, you technically have to file a police report about that. And there's like certain information that you have to fill out, like your information, like your license information, I believe, and then the information about the other party. And if you don't file one, you'll get a ticket and you can be fined up to, I believe it's a $500 fine, up to $500 fine. So make sure you file a crash report if you don't call law enforcement. But like I said, you should call law enforcement in every situation. And if you get into an accident, don't say things like, I'm sorry. Just, don't say anything that you're admitting to the other driver that makes it seem like it's your fault. Although it's worth mentioning that in Florida, we have what's called the accident reporter's privilege, where anything you tell the law enforcement officer who's investigating the crash is privileged. They can't use that in court. And the crash report, I believe, is confidential for like 60 days or something. And they can't use anything in the crash report in subsequent legal proceedings. But anything you tell the other driver is fair game. They can repeat in court. So be truthful to the law enforcement officer, unless the officer tells you that they've concluded the crash investigation and are now doing a criminal investigation, in which case, again, you have the right to remain silent when it comes to criminal investigations. So once the officer tells you that it's becoming, or it has become a criminal investigation, you don't have to talk anymore. And you shouldn't talk anymore. And you don't have to tell the officer anything. Rental cars, these are just general information. If you don't have insurance, like if you don't drive or have a car in the US and you don't have any car insurance, please, I would highly recommend, because we get these cases all the time from international students where they get into an accident in a rental car and then now they've become liable for the entire damage. Please purchase insurance when you reserve a rental car. They'll typically call it like a loss damage waiver, which is basically any kind of like if your car gets stolen or if there's some sort of injury, the insurance will cover it. Or collision damage waiver, which is for like if you get into a car accident, it'll pay for the repairs of the cars. But talk to your insurance or the rental car person and make sure you get the insurance for the car, because I mean, car accidents, you could be the safest driver, but you just don't have control over what other people will do. And you may end up being liable for tens of thousands of dollars for something that's not even your fault. So please get insurance. And keep in mind that when you rent a car, you're the only person that can drive it. So if you want other people to be able to drive it and still be covered with the insurance, you add them as an authorized driver. when you pick it up. So they'll be able to drive the car also. Some credit cards do offer rental car protection, but please read that fine print. Make sure it covers the situation that you're thinking about, because most of those policies don't cover anything other than a certain amount of physical damage to the vehicles. Some things that are worth mentioning, but not worth getting into, big detail about, are sex scams. People will try to get you to send them photos. They'll pretend to be, an attractive woman or a man, and then ask you for photos that are, quote unquote, compromising, usually nude photos from you. And what they'll do is once you send that photo, they'll hold it hostage or try to extort you out of money, saying, hey, I'm going to put this on the internet, blast it everywhere, send it to your advisor, send it to your school, if you don't give me like $10,000. That's a very common scam. So make sure, first of all, you shouldn't be sending photos of yourself, compromising photos of yourself online or in any form at all anyway. But just make sure you don't do that to somebody that you have no idea who they are. And also copyright trolls. We call them trolls because, they make their living from suing people for copyright infringement. Essentially what happens is you use a photo that's quote unquote royalty free, but it turns out there are some requirements that you failed to read. For example, like they'll ask for attribution, which means you have to put the name of the person who owns the copyright in whatever slide or presentation that you used it in. And you fail to do that, you're going to get some kind of contact from an attorney saying you violated someone's copyright laws, and then they'll ask you for, usually it's like $2,000 to $5,000, and you'll have to pay that because you did technically violate copyright laws. So watch out for that. Make sure any image, video that you use, you comply with all the requirements. Even if it's royalty free, make sure you read the fine print and make sure everything is usable. And then car seats for children. In Florida, at least, you need rear-facing car seats and this is just general information. Typically, it's by weight, but typically ages from newborns to 2-year-olds, you have to have a car seat that's rear-facing. It's like one of those, they're just seats. They're not the seats in your car, but they're separate seats that you buy. So they have to be rear-facing and then forward-facing once they turn 2 or a certain weight. And then you just use booster seats, just the bottom part of the car seats, for ages 4 to 5 or until they reach a certain height. I think the height is like 4'11". Once they reach that height, you don't have to use booster seats anymore. But keep in mind, you can get in serious trouble for not having a car seat for your child. Not to mention, like, you could technically face DCF. They may take your child away if you don't use car seats. All right, and that's our presentation. If you have any questions or any comments, you can put them in the chat right now and we'll try to answer them for you. Again, this is being recorded, and it's, being seen by 16 other people. So if you don't want it to be public, set an appointment with us. That QR code, if you scan it and go to that website, that's for setting appointments with our office. Go to that website, set an appointment, and then we can discuss it like one-on-one and try to alleviate your issues. But if you have general questions or general comments or critiques about how bad my presentation was, just put it in the chat and we can address it.
I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording now.